Destiny 2 has a lot of buffs and debuffs, and overall it can get really confusing. Some stack together, some don't, but one of the most obvious combos is the Warlock's Well of Radiance being a buff and the Hunter's Tether being a debuff. However, in today's video, I want to cover 7 lesser used damage boosting methods that everyone should be taking advantage of. Every scenario has a different need for a different buff and debuff, so here are 7 ways to buff your output damage that doesn't always revolve around a Well of Radiance and a tether. First on the list is the Boots of the Assembler for the Warlock. This exotic has to be one of the most slept on exotics in the Warlock's loadout. Basically, to keep it short, the way this one works is whenever you put down a healing rift and you as a guardian stand in it by yourself, it's going to send out noble seekers to your ally fire team members, and these noble seekers will depend on what rift you create. So if you're standing in a healing rift, it's going to restore 75 HP and start health regeneration. However, if you're standing in an empowering rift, it's going to buff your teammates' damage by 35%. And every time these noble seekers reach out and attach to a fire team member, it's going to extend your rift's duration by 5 seconds. Now, in certain situations where your entire team can't just stand in a Well of Radiance and damage a boss, the Boots of the Assembler can be really good. One great example of a perfect situation for these is Vow of the Disciple when you're fighting Rolk. As you know, there is plenty of opportunities where Rolk can dive and jump around, and you constantly need to be on your feet. If you have a Warlock standing in the back corner in an empowering rift, even though your teammates are moving around, they're always going to have a 35% damage buff. However, it is still a 35% weapon damage buff, which is really good. Now, with some minor tweaks, this exotic could be S tier for Warlocks, but for now, it's okay and it's pretty good, but I've got to put that on the list because it is a damage boosting method. Next on the list is the Ballador's Wrathweavers, yet another damage boosting Warlock exotic. Now, the way these ones work is whoever is the user of the exotic, they need to use their stasis super and then use the shatter animation. This will then give all guardians near you a 15% damage buff to all stasis weapons, which when you look at it that way isn't the best, but there is 2 great weapons to use with this, one of them being the Bump in the Night rocket launcher and the Reach Regret linear fusion rifle. Now, let's just quickly cover the pros to this exotic before we cover the cons. This 15% damage buff is completely different to every other buff in the game, and for some reason this does stack with a well buff, it also stacks with a debuff like Tether, and it will also stack with all of your weapon boosting mods like Stasis Surges. So, with the correct setup, you can do some ridiculous damage. However, the cons to this exotic are really important. The first con is that whoever is using the Ballador's Wrathweavers doesn't get the Stasis buff. It only buffs Stasis weapons, and unless you're playing with a really well organized team, it's going to be really awkward and hard to set up properly. But if you could, it can be a really good exotic. Up next on the list is the Lumina, and this one has been around since season 7, however I just don't see enough guardians talking about it or even using it. The way this gun works is very similar to the Boots of the Assembler. Whenever you kill an enemy, a little orb will drop on the floor. If you then go and pick that orb up, you can then hip fire the Lumina at your teammates, which will then send out little noble seekers, which will heal them and give them a 15% weapon buff. The Lumina can be really good to do extra damage to a boss, but the way I specifically like to use the Lumina is around the mid-game content when you're not killing or doing damage to a boss. Now, what I mean by this is whenever you're not in a boss encounter, when you're running around killing enemies, you can just have you and your fire team have a constant 15% damage buff. Who's gonna say no to a constant 15% damage buff all of the time? And if you do get to that boss encounter and you don't have a Well of Radiance, well, the Lumina is gonna come in handy. Now, the next 2 on this list is for all of you Hunter mains out there. First up, we have the Mask of Bacchus. Now, I know there's plenty of other damage boosting Hunter exotics out there, but the Mask of Bacchus is one not to be left behind. Basically, whenever you have a Stasis subclass equipped alongside Mask of Bacchus, whenever you use your class ability, it's going to give you a 25% damage buff to all of your arc weapons. This buff will last 10 seconds and only for arc weapons. But as we know, there are plenty of damage dealing arc weapons out there, a couple to name: the Hothead, the Grand Overture, and even the Storm Chaser linear fusion rifle. Now, with little to no setup except for using a class ability, the 25% damage buff can be really handy in nuking bosses or or champions or something similar. Now the way this buff works is it basically gives you 4 arc weapon surges, so this will stack with something like a Well of Radiance or a debuff. So it's a pretty good exotic and it's one to add for the list. Up next is the Lucky Pants for the Hunter. Now this exotic is a lot of fun and it is super powerful, and I don't see enough Guardians using it. And with Bungie stating there will be a hand cannon buff in the upcoming seasons, this could be the #1 Hunter loadout. Now the way these ones work is whenever you have these equipped and you pull out a hand cannon, it's going to give you 5.5 seconds with a stacking 60% damage buff per shot. So every shot will add 60% damage to the next shot, stacking at a total of 600% weapon damage with your hand cannon. This build works great with the Crimson or the Malfeasance or the Last Word or even the Ariana's Vow. This 600% damage buff will also stack with Radiant and also weapon surge mods, adding up to a total of 923% weapon damage boost. And you can do this every 10 to 15 seconds. And the best part of it is that you can do this all by yourself as a solo Hunter Guardian, which requires no other help from any other classes. Now the next one on this list is for all of you Titan mains out there. Now this one doesn't in particularly boost damage, but it is to do with the Sentinel Shield and the exotic Ursa Furiosa. Now as we know, Titans instead of putting a bubble down can pull up a huge Sentinel Shield, which they can use to either attack enemies or block damage from enemies. Now if the Titan holds up the block and all of your fire team shoot through the shield, this damage will be buffed by 40%. Now don't quote me, but I believe this is the highest single buff that you can do, and what I mean is it's the only buff by itself that will do increased damage up to 40%. Now the way the Ursa Furiosa ties into this is, well, whenever you take damage, it's going to convert that damage back into super energy up to 50%, meaning you're going to get your super back faster than if you didn't have the Ursa Furiosas equipped. So by this math, if you can get your super back twice as fast as usual, that means you can get off twice as many Sentinel Shields, meaning you can do 40% increased damage more often, which in terms will do more damage. Now, unfortunately, you do lose a bit of damage because the Titan, one member of your fire team, is holding up a shield, meaning they can't do the damage, but with the 40% damage buff that it supplies, it almost makes up for the loss of damage from the Titan. Where this really kicks in is when your Titan is fully out of heavy ammo and special, and they really can't do any damage, so what they can do is sacrifice the minimal damage they can do to then boost your fire team's total damage by 40%. Now the last one on this list is the Aspect Echo of Undermining, which every single Void class, whether you're a Titan, Warlock or Hunter, can equip. Now what Echo of Undermining does is whoever is affected by your grenade will receive a 15% debuff. With all of the different Void builds out there, you can get your grenade cooldown down to just a couple of seconds, meaning whenever you throw this grenade out, you're constantly debuffing every enemy for 15%. Now because a debuff can be stacked with a buff and also weapon surges, having a constant debuff in your fire team is really handy. So if you don't have a Hunter with Night Stalker to apply that debuff, just put on the Echo of Undermining aspect and you have a grenade that will debuff enemies whenever you need. With all of my Void builds recently, I've always left a spare slot for Echo of Undermining because it is seriously underrated. But anyway Guardians, that will sum up all of the 7 lesser used damage buffs that you guys can be taking advantage of. These could come in handy in the following few weeks with the Reprise raid coming very soon, and if you haven't tried these buffs or debuffs out, I recommend you give them a go. But anyway Guardians, thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to drop a like and a subscribe down below. But anyway, thank you for watching and I'll see you later.